everybody, and welcome to one of our first episodes in the Stormie Grace YouTube Academy. It's a very exciting time. We've all pulled together to make some astrology happen here. And before we jump into the actual lessons and techniques, I wanted to bring a friend over and an absolute professional to walk through the history of astrology so that as we're getting into it, we also see and have a pathway from what we've come from, what we've built from, and where we're moving towards as we engage these techniques and some of the thought processes that were available while astrology was making its way forward. So I am more than thrilled that here at the beginning to welcome in Chris Brennan. Welcome, welcome.
Hey, Stormie, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I thought about, okay, I want to do this history piece, and you were the first name in. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. And, we were talking a little bit before, and I think this is important as we are studying and we're practicing, that I have left the space of trying to be all things for astrology. So it
Right.
is brilliant to be surrounded by other people and think, oh, my colleague who does this knows it in a way that I don't know it, and we can still collaborate and present that. And I think this is very much so a synthesis of that today.
Yeah, I think that's a really important critical feature about being an astrologer is like coming to specialize in some specific areas, but then also knowing the things that you don't specialize in and being able to like network and connect with other people who do specialize in that in order to learn more and grow and develop as an astrologer.
Yeah, I agree 1,000%. And so I'm pumped and I'm ready and I want to get right into this. And I actually have some questions I thought of along the way as I was reviewing the history and thinking about our conversation. And so I'm going to start off with a question, if that's okay. Um,
Okay.
in the history, we look at these times and we go back to the Babylonians, and that's very exciting. But do you think it's appropriate when we're talking about the history of astrology, we're talking about the history of astrology as we know it now, as opposed to just the history of astrology? Because there's this sense I have that we've been astronomers and astrologers all along, even
Mhm.
before we put it to paper. Do you think that's
Right.
fair?
Yeah, there's definitely many different astrologies, and there's many different, types of astrology and different histories of astrology in different areas from, Mesopotamia and Egypt and China and Mesoamerica and many different areas. So, for our purposes, we're talking about the history primarily of Western astrology and what we know based on largely the written record over the past 4,000 years or so.
Yeah. So, and I think it is important while we're having this conversation to be zoning in on that this is what we're talking about at this time, because there is just too much astrology out there that has happened that we can't zone in on right now, or that just as a whole, as a people, we don't know about yet to engage a full on discussion of, no, it actually happened here. No, this actually happened over here. I kind of feel like that can be a little bit of, divisive controversy that comes up when we're actually just discussing something that is pretty straight, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, we do our best because there's a tricky thing where there's a lot of different oral histories of astrology and different periods where a lot of astrology happens either between astrologer and client that's just like a verbal exchange that's never recorded, or sometimes techniques and certain things are passed down from teacher to student for generations based on oral teachings, and that's stuff that we'll never have, access to. But that being said, there's still lots and lots of astrology texts from different eras of history that did survive. And it's interesting to see what we can reconstruct from, even a handful of texts that maybe survived from the first century or from the, 2000 BCE or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. It's neat to hear about that. And it was just a vision I was thinking about. I was just standing outside and thinking, now the ancients, their intellect was equal to or superior to ours, I think, but they didn't have the means of material progress that we have today to have brought those things forward. So as we look at the sky out there, or we sit with clients and look at the sky through a chart, we are seeing a fair amount of what they did as well. And they were astronomers and astrologers in that fashion already, because they had to acknowledge what was happening around them and then interpret it into something. And so now we're going to bring that into, okay, we're heading into learning the basics of Western astrology. How did we get here?
Yeah, and something you just said actually is a really good starting point, which is you said we look at the sky, and then you said actually we look at the chart, because for many of us, astrology is this thing that lives in these two-dimensional diagrams, which are a birth chart and an image or a depiction of the birth chart, which is, like a two-dimensional map that's supposed to represent the alignment of the cosmos at the moment a person was born. But for many ancient people, that wasn't the starting point for astrology. The starting point for astrology was that they actually had a much closer connection to going outside every night and looking at the sky and looking at the stars and watching the movements of the planets and like the rising of the sun and its culmination and setting each day and all of these other celestial phenomenon. It was a very intimate experience for them because they were experiencing it on a much more visceral level on a day-to-day basis. So that's probably our starting point for this, is just realizing that astronomy was a much more personal thing in the ancient world because astrologers were going out and watching the night sky every single night.
Yeah, so I agree. I think that's a beautiful place to start. So at the beginning here, where we're coming in to learn together, if you want to stand in the history, the present, and probably the future, just go outside and start watching what's happening. That is probably one of, like you said, the most intimate ways to embody where we've already been and where we're going. So that's a beautiful place to start with. Hey, why don't you go outside? I mean, maybe not in Colorado right now. It's a bit cold here. We're in the negatives.
Yeah, I would not recommend going outside in Colorado, but let's say that you are somewhere else. Especially for our purposes, most of this story begins about 4,000 years ago, about 2000 BCE, in ancient Mesopotamia, which is roughly located where modern day Iraq is. And for our purposes, this is basically where the story of astrology begins,
Mm.
because about 2000 BCE, there were people where they started going outside and viewing the planets and the stars and other celestial phenomenon, and they started noticing correlations between celestial movements and earthly events, where something would happen in the sky, like there would be an eclipse, and then something significant would happen on the earth, like let's say the death of a king or a famine or something like that. And they started writing down these observations of celestial movements and earthly events on little clay tablets, using a language called cuneiform. And they started building up libraries of these observations of like celestial movements and earthly events. And this was the basic starting point or building point, essentially, of astrology. So, one of these tablets that I always love to read is this one called the Diviner's Manual, where it formulates what is essentially the basic astrological premise, where it says, sky and earth together produce omens. Each is separate but not divided. Sky and earth are interconnected.
Mm.
A sign which is bad in the sky is bad on earth, and a sign which is bad on earth is also bad in the sky. So this is basically the fundamental astrological premise developed in Mesopotamia, that there's a correlation between celestial movements and earthly events. It's not necessarily that the planets and the stars are causing things to happen on Earth, but instead they're acting as like signs or omens of things that are happening at that time. Just like a clock on the wall indicates that it's 9 o'clock in the morning without it necessarily being the reason or the cause that it's 9 o'clock in the morning. That's kind of how the planets and stars were thought to indicate things about the future in the ancient world.
Which makes a lot of sense, I think, as I formulate the idea, even in my teaching and going, forward now presently, that those big balls in the sky, we are made of all of the same things essentially. So if something is happening to the bigger thing, it's going to roll downhill, right? And if something is happening downhill here and we kind of can't figure out what's going on or where is this coming from, if we trace that same vibration or that same frequency to that bigger body, we're able to see that direct vibrational correlation to what's happening and therefore come up with solutions or processes forward.
Yeah, exactly. And it was very much tied into the ancient notions of divination and attempts to learn information about the future by studying omens and studying signs and correlations. And there were many different forms of divination, and astrology was one of the later forms of divination that was used. And it eventually became the most important form of divination in some ways in the ancient world as astrologers gained more and more importance in society. So in
Mm.
Mesopotamia, they eventually developed the 12 signs of the zodiac by the 5th century BCE. And around that time, they also developed the concept of natal astrology. So prior to that time, most of the astrology in Mesopotamia was all what we call mundane astrology, where astrological movements and correlations are applied to entire cities or populations or states of people, so like groups of people, as well as to natural phenomenon such as like weather or earthquakes. So it's applying astrology to the population as a whole and saying that that eclipse relates to like the entire populace in some way or has some major factor that's going to affect all of us. But eventually, after many centuries of this practice of mundane astrology, by the 5th century BCE, around the time that the zodiac was developed, they introduced the concept that the alignment of the planets at the moment that a person is born has something to say about their life and the nature of their life and their future. And that's the basic concept of natal astrology, basically, of birth charts.
Which is absolutely fabulous because I think about when I make little discoveries in my life that it's just like, a little revelation. And here are these ancient astrologers and they're mapping what's happening in the sky and then watching people take form and characteristic of what they are talking about, essentially watching a correct interpretation of the vibrations. I mean, that had to be incredibly exciting, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is exciting when you see those correlations happening and you see how well it works and how strikingly astrology can tell you things about either what's going on in the present or things that are coming up in the future. There is something that's very exciting and sort of like powerful about that and very moving.
Absolutely. And of course, it makes sense, though, that this is where the kings and people in positions of power would have wanted to have access to that, exclusive access even to that, because that's very powerful. So it belongs in the hands of the powerful, maybe would have been the idea.
Yeah, and at one point, like the high point of state-supported astrology in Mesopotamia was around the 7th or 8th century BCE, and there were at least 10 different colleges of astrologers that were set up all over Mesopotamia. And the astrologers were also astronomers because the two professions were still intertwined at that time. So they would go out every night and they would observe the stars and see if there was anything special that had occurred or anything unique or out of the ordinary. And then they would write reports into the king to tell them what was going on. And that was sort of like, in some way, the intelligence services of the king, in some ways, was these different colleges of astrologers telling them information and giving them important knowledge about what was going on in the present as well as the future.
So, and I honestly don't know the answer to this because I haven't read enough about it, but do you think there were many astrologers as well who lost their heads, literally, for getting it wrong?
Yeah, sometimes, I mean, if you gave a bad prediction or something that turned out to be wrong, then that could put you on the outs with the person in charge. There's famous stories later on of during the Roman Empire, the early Roman Empire especially, there was an emperor named Tiberius, and before he became emperor, he had a bad reputation for testing astrologers. And basically, the test was that you would meet with the emperor on this island and he had a villa that was set up on the side of a very high cliff overlooking the sea. And he would go and you would read his chart, and then this guy Tiberius would then turn the tables on the astrologer, and he would say, "Now, what do you see today in your chart?" And if they didn't say like immediate impending danger, they were thrown off the side of the cliff, and then they would die. And so there was this one astrologer named Thrasyllus who went one day and he did this interview. And at the end of it, after predicting great things about this person who he had just read his chart and saying he would become the emperor someday, which was true, uh, the emperor, the soon-to-be emperor, then turned the tables and asked Thrasyllus what he saw in his chart. And Thrasyllus pulled out his chart and did some calculations and calculated his transits or his Time Lord periods. And then he, according to the legend as it goes, suddenly broke out into a cold sweat and said, I am in the most immediate impending danger of my life, or something to that effect. And then Tiberius then turns to Thrasyllus and says something to the effect of, you're hired and you've got the job. And Tiberius then made Thrasyllus his closest advisor for the rest of their lives. And they both lived until 36 CE or so, and they both died within about a year of each other. So Thrasyllus then became a very powerful and influential advisor to, I think he was only like the second Roman emperor.
What a job interview.
Yeah, well, it was a really stark thing that even though astrology tends to be more character-based and more client-oriented today, at different points in history, astrologers have not just consulted with normal people and people from the middle class, but also were occasionally in the very highest sort of echelons of power.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about the difference as we're coming forward between the Greeks and the Romans and their perspectives on astrology?
Sure. So let's see. Before we get there, so we talked about the origins of mundane astrology in Mesopotamia and natal astrology, and also that the zodiac comes from Mesopotamia, basically. But there was another development that was really important over in Egypt, where the Egyptians, who were sort of like next door neighbors to Mesopotamia, in Egypt, they had their own form of astrology that was developing at the same time, roughly concurrently. And this form of astrology was based on 36 fixed stars or asterisms that were known as the decans or the deacons.
Okay, yeah.
So the Egyptians focused on looking at, once they had identified these 36 fixed stars or fixed star clusters, they would use them for timing, especially for religious rituals, when certain deacons were either rising over the western or the eastern horizon or culminating directly overhead. And they would use this for timing. So what's interesting and important for this is actually the precursor to the later concept of the 12 houses, which are the 12 sectors of life. But the 12 houses are very much tied into and anchored on the ascendant or the rising sign, which rises over the eastern horizon at the moment of birth, as well as the midheaven sign, which is like the sign that's culminating, or the planets that are culminating at the moment of birth. And we can see a precursor to that here in the use of the decans by the Egyptians, going back at least maybe 1000 to 2000 BCE.
And so from the beginning, in terms of the Western astrology as it's coming forward and we know it today, as they were looking at the sky, was this still based from the beginning on seasons? Were we still just following seasons there in our history, or had we not quite established that far yet?
Yeah, I mean, they had seasons and they paid attention to agricultural cycles, and then eventually they developed the zodiac, and the zodiac is partially based on the the solar cycle and the 365-day year that it takes the sun to move through the signs of the zodiac, as well as the 12 lunations that will take place during the course of an entire year. So they were kind of combining those different elements, and some of that was seasonal, and other elements were more symbolic, such as the constellations or the visible appearance of the planets had a major impact on how they were interpreted. So they started making distinctions between like the two gleaming stars that kind of twinkle in the night sky, which turned out to be Venus and Jupiter. And then there were these two other stars that would move slower, and one of them had a reddish hue, which was Mars, and the other one had more of a darker hue, and that was Saturn. And so they started making distinctions between, let's say, like the benefic planets, which are the so-called good doers, or the malefic planets, which are the so-called, evildoers, and making different distinctions like that based on visible phenomenon and just how the planets and stars appeared based on just looking at them with the naked eye.
Yeah, that's fabulous. And I think it's also always interesting too, because I came in at a time where you could type it all into a computer program and have it tell you what's happening, even tell you where current transits are in the sky. And it just was not that way. You had to go out and really watch, like you said, that visible phenomenon happen and play out and understand the timing of when you might see that again.
Yeah, and eventually they did, after many, many centuries, the interest in astrology and the desire to learn the future through astrology helped to promote and help to spur the development of more advanced forms of mathematical astronomy. And eventually, by the 5th century, they started being able to produce ephemerides, which is like a book basically of planetary positions, so that you can look up where the planets will be or where they were far in the past, or you can look up where the planets will be far in the future, because they realized that the planetary movements were fixed and cyclical, which meant that once you understood their periods, you could calculate them mathematically and not have to observe them yourself with the naked eyes. So that's the point at which astrology and astronomy started diverging a bit, because the astrologers increasingly were able to start just calculating charts based on ephemerides and based on tables, without always having to look at them directly, which is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, that's tremendously useful and gives you a lot more you can do with astrology if you don't have to view the planets directly yourself in order to calculate them. But it also then started the slow drift between astronomy and astrology.
Sure. And so it's interesting to think about it that way, where it's like today, it sounds like the division between astronomy and astrology is that it can seem that the astronomers think that the astrologers are very woo-woo people,
Mhm.
right? And that is not necessarily always the case. We're just observing them differently.
Yeah, at this point in time, astronomy is the observation and the measurement of the movements of the planets and stars and other celestial phenomenon, whereas astrology is the interpretation of what the movement of the planets and stars and other celestial phenomenon mean for people in their personal lives, or in terms of what that means symbolically for life on Earth, and especially in terms of the correlation between celestial movements and earthly events.
Yeah.
Um, so we mentioned Egypt and Mesopotamia, and like astrology was developing for a couple thousand years in both of those areas. But then something really important happened around the 4th century BCE, where there was a young Macedonian prince and king named Alexander, later known as Alexander the Great, who took an army of Mesopotamians and Greeks, and they stormed out of southern Europe, out of Greece and Macedonia, and they went down and they conquered the Persian Empire, which took up a large part of the known world at that time. And Alexander's army went down through Egypt, and they took over Egypt. And then he went and basically fought the Persian Empire and the Persian king at the time, all the way across Mesopotamia and the Middle East, all the way over through Afghanistan into the westernmost portions of India, before eventually Alexander's army sort of mutinied because they'd gone so far away from home, and forced him to turn back. And Alexander, on his way back, passed through Mesopotamia, where he promptly died at a relatively young age, leaving that entire kingdom to his generals, who then started going to war with each other in order to, fight over who would take over the new empire. But in the process, basically, Alexander conquered and took over and installed Greek-speaking rulers in those two areas that we were just looking at, where astrology had developed in those two separate cultures in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And that's important for our purposes, because then all of a sudden, those two areas were interlinked, and people started speaking Greek across the ancient world as the common language that was used for like science and culture and philosophy and commerce and other things like that. And all of a sudden, it meant there was this great exchange that started happening between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and their astrologies started to intermingle. So this ends up, within a century or two, leading to an important turning point around the 1st century BCE, where we see the birth of what's called horoscopic astrology. And horoscopic astrology is any type of astrology that utilizes the ascendant, which was called the horoscopos, or the hour marker in ancient astrology. and some of the points that are derived from the ascendant, which includes the system of 12 houses, which are derived from the ascendant. So this was the birth of what we call horoscopic astrology, which is any astrology that uses the ascendant and houses, but also of what we call Hellenistic astrology in general, which is a synthesis of the Mesopotamian concept of the zodiac with the Egyptian concept of the decans, so that you have houses, but also at this point we have the introduction of concepts like the aspects, the conjunctions, sextile, square, trine, and opposition were introduced at this point. And basically most of the basic concepts of Western astrology that we still associate with astrology today, 2,000 years ago, were introduced around this time in the 1st century BCE.
So somewhere in there, though, right, this is where we see in that Greek mentality that Plato and Aristotle are kind of leading the charge. Is that the correct timing in there?
Yeah, Plato and Aristotle were basically just before this time, because there was like Plato, and then Plato was a teacher to Aristotle, and Aristotle was actually a tutor to Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
So Alexander then conquered all of that, the known world, and astrology, natal astrology, was just starting to get going by that time. So it was just a couple centuries later then, after Greek had sort of really settled in those two different cultures, that intermingling took place, and then all of a sudden this new form of astrology kind of emerges out of that time period. And all of a sudden we have the introduction of things like associating specific planets with certain signs of the zodiac, as well as associating certain planets with certain houses. So the rulership scheme, the traditional rulership scheme, is introduced at this point, and this ended up being a really crucial concept that's persisted more or less for the past 2,000 years, where you basically you have the 12 signs of the zodiac, and you assign the two luminaries, the moon and the sun, to the two signs that follow the summer solstice, which is the hottest and brightest part of the year in the northern hemisphere where astrology was developed. So you put the two luminaries in those two signs following the summer solstice that basically coincide with the summertime. Then you assign each of the other 5 traditional visible planets that can be seen with the naked eye to the signs that follow just after the luminaries based on their relative speed and distance from the sun. So Mercury is the next planet out from the sun, so it gets assigned to the two signs flanking the luminaries, which are Gemini and Virgo. Then Venus is the next furthest and slowest planet, so it's assigned to the next set of signs, which is Libra and Taurus. Then Mars is the next planet out, so it's assigned to Scorpio and Aries. Then Jupiter to Sagittarius and Pisces, and then finally Saturn to Capricorn and Aquarius. So that's the traditional rulership scheme, basically. And there's like a logic, or there's a schematization to it like that, which is kind of unique. And there's a bunch of different pieces of Hellenistic astrology that are like that are very schematic and where there's a lot of symmetries involved.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting too to go back and look at, so we've got the Greeks and the Romans, and we've got that situation happening, and just culturally, even when we talk about signs or archetypes or myths of the signs today, that they still had two different views of some of the primary signs. I mean, one in specific, looking at Aries, if we're talking about it in Greek, you have one symbolism of him as this soldier, just the warrior, the death, and all of that carries forward, whereas the Romans also saw him as a sacred soldier or gardener. So there's kind of the cultural pieces feel like they also really just get involved in the interpretation of the astrology coming forward.
Yeah, definitely. There was a big intermingling of cultures in the Mediterranean region at this time. And this was also around the time of the advent of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire grew out of Italy and then eventually took over the entire Mediterranean region within the next century or two, not long after Hellenistic astrology was developed. And that seems to have been basically the high point of the practice of ancient Hellenistic Greco-Roman astrology, was around the 2nd century, when the Roman Empire was at its height. And this just shows a picture from Wikipedia where it shows the extent of the Roman Empire, which is basically the entire Mediterranean, which covers parts of northern Africa and Egypt, and parts of the Middle East and Turkey and Greece and Italy and Spain and parts of Europe and like France and stuff like that. So it was this huge empire connecting a bunch of different cultures together into this kind of like melting pot where astrology at that time reflected a number of different cultural influences rather than just one culture or one approach.
Absolutely. And so then we begin to make our way into France and have that influence of the French culture as well, I think, right? Am I tracking my timing correctly?
A little bit. The French influence was a little bit later. I mean, what happens at this point is astrology becomes very important and very influential in the ancient world. It's primarily focused on natal astrology, although they also start practicing electional astrology, which is picking auspicious moments to begin new ventures and undertakings based on the astrological chart for the birth of that venture. And it's basically taking the premise of natal astrology and then applying it to events and saying that you can choose different times that are going to be more or less auspicious in order to, do things just based on astrology. So astrology is very popular at this time. It's primarily natal astrology. It starts getting transmitted to other cultures. So, for example, there was a text on astrology that was transmitted from Egypt to India at this time, and there was some sort of interaction or merging between Greek astrology and Indian astrology at that time around the 3rd century or so CE. There was also some texts on Greek astrology that were translated into Persian that influenced and interacted with those traditions. So one of the common themes in the history of astrology is basically anytime you put two astrologers in the same room together, they will start talking to each other and exchanging and comparing techniques and ideas. And some of the ways that they approach astrology will start rubbing off on each other. And that ends up creating a new form of astrology that is like a synthesis or a merging of whatever their two approaches are. It's one of the like inevitabilities in the history of astrology that just comes up over and over again.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I've done a whole bunch of eat and greets, and now I feel like I have techniques from all of you.
Right. Yeah, especially because astrology is like a language, and it's interesting once you're exposed to a different language, there's some people that may be better or more fluent and make it may be easier for them to pick up new languages. But even if you're not super good at picking up new languages, if you're exposed to something enough, you'll eventually start recognizing certain words, and certain words might be integrated into your own vocabulary at some point so that your own language is changed by that interaction in some way.
Absolutely, which I think is neat that you're bringing that up, especially since we're doing this big thing on YouTube and we are a bunch of astrologers from multiple different practices. So it has definitely been a blending for us to figure out how to create cohesiveness going forward too. But at each step, it is the opportunity to get the basics while also hearing the threads of other languages spoken by other astrologers to inform our practices. So I think that's going to be really neat to see how that is still a continuation of the very history we're talking about right now.
Yeah, definitely. So the Roman Empire, astrology is really popular there. It peaks in like the 2nd and 3rd century CE. Eventually, astrology, though, starts to go into a decline that coincides with the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire, especially in the West. So there's the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries. So there's a declining in learning and literacy, which makes it harder for astrology to be practiced there. At the same time, there's increased hostility towards astrology from Christianity because there were some theological conflicts between astrology and Christianity in the ancient world after Christianity developed in the 1st century CE. And even though in the Bible, in the New Testament, there's some positive things said about astrology. For example, the 3 magi are said to visit Jesus based on following a celestial omen that was sent by God that led them to, or indicated to them, that the birth of somebody important had just taken place. So despite there occasionally being some like positive coverage for astrology there was tensions with astrology because Christian theologians placed a high degree of focus on the concept of free will, and they saw astrology being more focused on fate as being too deterministic. And so that was one of the things that where astrology clashed with Christian theology in the first few centuries, and it led to Christians outlawing astrology eventually once it became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire from the like 4th century forward.
Which is interesting because weren't there still, here we are, we've got this outlaw situation and astrologers still found in prominent places, helping advise, helping to guide process forward in history. I think it's like that, when we look back through the history, it's like, this is not allowed, but also these people can do it.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the tricky things is that astrology still survived and astrology was still practiced. And one of the things one of my teachers, Nicholas Campion, taught me or always said at Kepler College when we were learning the history of astrology is he said that sometimes people, when they look at the history of astrology and they see the Christian church repeatedly issuing bans on astrology, that indicates that astrology wasn't being practiced or couldn't be practiced then because it was outlawed. But in fact, when you see that, what you should realize is that they're issuing those bans repeatedly because astrology is being practiced so widely that they have to keep trying to ban it,
Right.
and that the bans weren't necessarily working, so that we should see the repeated ones as almost like, being frustrated and trying to get rid of something, but not being fully successful.
So almost like an opposition.
Right, exactly. Or like prohibition or something like that. Like you think of prohibition in the United States when they outlawed drinking and stuff, and yet it still ended up being very prevalent. And eventually they just gave up and they had to repeal prohibition in the end because nobody was, it wasn't working, like keeping it against the law.
Yeah, the bootleggers were making a killing.
Yeah, exactly. So there were kind of like bootleg astrologers back in the day in the like late Roman Empire. Astrology texts continued to be carried forward and copied over by scribes, sometimes in monasteries. At the same time, even though astrology died out a little bit in the Western Roman Empire, there was a new empire that came out of the Middle East starting in the 7th century CE. And this was the beginning of the Islamic Empire, the Arabic Empire, which started basically in modern day Saudi Arabia and then expanded out of there across the entire Middle East through northern Africa all the way into parts of southern Europe into Spain by its height in like the 7th and 8th centuries. And what happened there is that the Islamic Empire then controlled, most of the Mediterranean at that point, which used to be the previous Roman Empire. And some of the early Islamic rulers were much more open to learning and philosophy and science and wisdom than some of the late Roman emperors were, so that the Islamic rulers, they set up a new capital in Baghdad, and the caliph at the time, or the king at the time, got together a group of astrologers and he asked them to pick an auspicious electional chart for the founding of what would be the new capital called Baghdad. And so these astrologers got together and they picked the most auspicious chart they could find for the founding of the new capital. And in this new capital, they set up a translation project and they started translating into Arabic as many of the older astrological texts as they could find from Greek and Latin and Sanskrit and other languages. And then all of a sudden, all of the activity from like the 8th century onward moved to astrologers who were writing in Arabic and who were practicing astrology during the early medieval period from that point forward.
So it almost is like it really depended, the astrology surviving depended on whoever could interpret it and carry it forward. And I would think too, since in our history just of people, you didn't always live until you were 84 or 116. That was not entirely common as this is happening. So to keep a line or to keep a practice alive was not done with as much ease. So you really had to have somebody to carry that forward.
Yeah, and really the biggest thing was books and technical manuals. And you have to remember that in the ancient world, in this time period, if you wanted to get a copy of a book had to be copied over manually by hand, and a scribe had to sit down with a pen and literally look at the text in front of them and copy it over word for word into a new book. And that's how you made copies of books, basically. So there was that process, but also the process of translating texts from earlier languages into whatever your current language is. And that's a process that happens every few hundred years, where every few hundred years the astrologers get excited about looking back into the ancient texts, and then they'll translate a bunch of them and then synthesize them with whatever the prevailing astrological systems are at that time. And it usually creates a new approach to astrology that then flourishes for like a century or two. That's kind of what we're going through today, but it's something that astrologers do about every 200 years.
And so just to bring it into a current reality, is this a portion of what Project Hindsight did look like at the time, where it was like, oh, let's translate this stuff? Was this astrology excitement?
Yeah, it was around the time of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in 1992 and 1993, and these translation projects often start around the time, I've noticed, of Uranus-Neptune conjunctions, which happen approximately every 175 years. So in the 1990s, there was a group of astrologers that got together and they got excited about translating ancient texts from Greek and Arabic and Latin and other languages into modern languages so that we could recover some of this ancient wisdom and bring it forward into the present. And it turned out that astrology as it's practiced today is much different than how astrology was practiced 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago or 2,000 years ago. So the idea 20 or 30 years ago was, let's translate all these texts and read them and then find out what good techniques they contained and then bring those forward into the future. And it will perhaps improve astrology and make it even better once we reconnect ourselves and our tradition or our lineage with that ancient knowledge.
Yeah, that is really, I think I get very excited about lineage because we're all part of it. I didn't start anything. So it's really neat to look to the past and see what we're a part of and where to carry that forward. I get very excited about that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see. So what's happening? I have a chart. Here's an image of the chart for Baghdad. This was the
Okay.
electional chart for the founding of Baghdad that the astrologers, it was like a group of like 4 or 5 astrologers picked out. This is the best they could come up with. In addition to that, during this time, the concept or the practice of horary astrology became very popular from the 8th century forward. And this was a somewhat new branch where basically what you do is when a client approaches you, you cast a chart for the moment that the client asks you a single specific question. And then the chart is supposed to describe both the question as well as the answer,
Mm.
the outcome to the question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's quick. I found my keys a couple times.
Yeah, so that was developed and it's used for different things like that, like finding objects or other questions. They introduced some new technical concepts around that time that helped with horary questions, such as the concept of a transfer of light, where you can have a fast moving planet that acts as an intermediary that connects to slower moving planets,
Mm.
allowing them to have an aspect or a relationship where they might not otherwise. So horary astrology is very popular at this point. Then eventually, what happens is Europe, which had been going through the Middle Ages and hadn't been doing very well for a few centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, they start recovering. And at one point, there is some problems in Spain where some of the Europeans start going down and trying to reclaim some of the lands that were conquered by the Islamic Empire in the earlier centuries in the Iberian Peninsula, which is like roughly modern day Spain and Portugal. And they started reconquering some of those lands. And then when they did, they discovered these huge libraries full of books and manuscripts
Mm.
that were written in Arabic. And what happened is there was a bunch of scholars around Europe that started flocking to Spain in order to translate these texts on science and philosophy and medicine and other things from Arabic into Latin and other European languages. And some of the first texts that they started translating were astrological texts. So all of a sudden in the 12th century, Europe basically rediscovers astrology, but they don't rediscover it through the earlier Greek texts or Latin texts, but instead they primarily rediscover this new synthesis of astrology that had been developed in Arabic in the 8th and 9th centuries. And that's the type of astrology then that's revived in Europe from the 12th and 13th century forward.
Wow. And so I wonder if along the way in any of that, how much of the translation that we have today that we carried forward was a mistranslation. Do we find that often as we're going through? You do quite a bit of history work. Do we find the mistranslations?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, part of the history of astrology, what happens is that it ends up being like a game of telephone. Did you ever play that in elementary
Yes.
school where
Yes.
it's like a bunch of kids, let's say 10 kids sit in a circle and next to each other, and then at the beginning of the circle, somebody whispers something into the first person's ear, and then that person's supposed to whisper that thing into the next person's ear, and they keep passing it around. And by the time you get to the end of the circle, like the message sometimes will be very different than what it started as. And sometimes that happens just as a result of mishearing or misinterpretation or mistakes. Like sometimes because we're talking about handwritten manuscripts,
Mhm.
sometimes there's stuff that gets left out or there's a typo or other things like that. So yeah, sometimes there can be like astrology can change both as a result of deliberate inventions and people adding or discovering new things, which adds to and changes the astrological system. But also sometimes there can be things that are forgotten or not passed on or misunderstood, and that can cause changes in the tradition as well, especially when it's being translated from language to language to language.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. I mean, I speak multiple languages and I'm learning another one. And sometimes it's like, oh, well, we don't actually have a word for that. So that
Right.
lends itself to almost creating a little bit of a different practice in and of itself if it's just that language to language translation that's coming down.
Yeah, and sometimes that's how you can tell when one culture's astrology has influenced another culture is there's going to be
Ah,
like loan words because there'll be like a concept that didn't exist in the culture where they're trying to translate that. So they'll just take the other culture's word for it and they'll use that as like a loan word or as like a technical term for that concept. So anyway, so astrology is revived in Europe, but it's this new type of astrology from the medieval period. And astrology gets really popular from the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries onward once we hit the period of the so-called Renaissance. And there's astrology becomes really popular and it's integrated into medicine at this time, partially as a diagnostic tool for diagnosing and treating illnesses. And there are also different chairs of astrology that are set up for astrology in universities at this time, so that astrology is actually being taught as part of the university curriculum in Europe from the 13th century forward.
and this is that time where it's like if you wanted to be the doctor or you wanted to be a lawyer or a surgeon, you had to have a pretty working knowledge of your astrology, astronomy. Is this that timing?
Yeah, because basically, imagine if you don't have like an MRI machine or you can't do x
Mhm.
rays on a person to see what's going on inside of them, that you don't have those advanced mechanical, technological diagnostic devices that we take for granted today. But you have this other technology, which is astrology, which can sometimes give you insight into things that you shouldn't otherwise be able to know. And so astrology was sometimes used within the context of medicine to try to get to the heart of and to try to understand what was going on with people in a medical context as a sort of tool or technology in the same way that we use, an x-ray machine or something today.
Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful visual. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So eventually the printing press is invented in the year 1440. And not long after that, there start being like printing presses all over Europe that spring up all over Europe. And what they do is they start printing up um, some of the Latin translations that were done in the 12th and 13th century of some of the earlier Arabic texts that were written in the 8th and 9th centuries. So, for example, here's a text of Masha Allah, who was an astrologer that lived in the 8th century and wrote in Arabic. And his text was translated into Latin in the 12th century, but then eventually it was printed up in like the 15th or 16th century once they started making the printing press. And they were basically just looking for what books would be popular that we could sell and print up from some of these earlier translation movements. So the invention of the printing press helped to sort of like the internet, it helped to popularize and to distribute astrology works even more widely than they had already been distributed.
Yeah, almost that idea, like when we started, that the ancients had this intellect that was absolutely lovely, working beautiful concepts and ideas, but not the material means to take it forward. And so then the printing press comes in, and it's like, yes, this has been around. We've been talking about it, translating, using this, looking at it forever, but now we have that next means to distribute.
Yeah, exactly. So that helped
Brilliant.
to distribute it more. Astrology is really popular. Eventually, by the 17th century, astrology starts going into a decline. We do see the last great flourishing of traditional astrology in Europe with authors like William Lilly and his contemporaries, where Lilly wrote the very first English language textbook on astrology. Up to that point, astrologers had primarily written in Latin, which was the educated
Mm,
language that scientific texts were written in Europe for several centuries. But Lilly wanted to make his text more accessible to normal people, so he wrote it in his common tongue, which was English. So Christian astrology then is one of those first textbooks in English that became very influential, and it created a precedent where everybody started switching to writing their texts in English after that
mm.
point instead of Latin. So Lilly's textbook is very much focused on horary astrology, and that was his primary form of astrology. And it was a very useful textbook because he includes a bunch of example charts of horary questions that he actually answered and received from clients. And he tells you how they worked out and what the outcome was and everything else. So it's like a good textbook for students. So,
Yeah.
despite that, astrology goes into a decline in Europe from the 17th century forward. This is due to a mixture of different social and scientific and religious changes. One of the major ones was the scientific revolution and Ptolemy's cosmology being disproven,
Mm.
and basically like a series of different scientific discoveries that changed how people viewed the cosmos. And in the process of making some of those changes, it started making people question if anything that they had assumed was true up to that point was correct. And astrology is one of the things that unfortunately kind of got swept up in some of those changes at that time. So
Yeah.
astrology disappears from universities. It's no longer seen as a legitimate subject, and it only sort of survives in the form of popular almanacs for the next couple of centuries, from the 17th through the 19th century.
Which is interesting because we do realize at that time that when it comes down to calculating or tracking agriculture, astrology's never lost its flair. So I think we've been able to beautifully keep with that. And then you've got the philosophers who are coming out very much so speaking against astrology, and that makes a good point for getting it out of those common places. But agriculture is our stuff.
Yeah, and one of the things that happened is that Claudius Ptolemy, back in the second century, he was like a scientist and polymath who lived in Egypt, and he wrote a very influential work on astronomy that became like the standard astronomical text for the next 1,000 or next 1,500 years. He also wrote a very influential astrological text at that time. And the way that he conceptualized astrology is that he wanted to defend astrology and consider it to not be a form of divination, but instead he wanted to conceptualize it as a natural science and something that worked as a result of physics and as a result of the planets and stars literally causing events on Earth to take
Mm.
place instead of just indicating or acting as omens that things would happen as they were conceptualized in the past or prior to that time. So the good thing about Ptolemy's approach is that that's part of why astrology was able to survive in the Roman Empire after that point, because despite it being attacked by Christianity, defenders of astrology would point to Ptolemy's work and say that astrology is not magic and it's not the work of the devil or it's not divination, but instead it's just a natural science that's describing something that is happening in our world, just like the weather or just like, the seasons based on sunlight or something like that. And that the planets similarly have some sort of influence on us was the way astrology was conceptualized as a result of Ptolemy. But the problem is that Ptolemy based part of this on a model of the cosmos that required the Earth to be the center of the cosmos.
Ah, yeah.
And what happened is during the scientific revolution, it was shown that the Earth was not the center of the cosmos, but instead the sun was the center of our solar system, and we were on a planet that's revolving around the sun. So that suddenly made everybody question Ptolemy's cosmology, which suddenly was disproven. And therefore, because everybody had put so much emphasis on Ptolemy's cosmology and Ptolemy's rationale for astrology for over 1,000 years at that point, it meant that they thought that astrology was disproven at the same time. But it wasn't really that astrology was disproven, it just meant that the way that it had been conceptualized up to that point was no longer correct.
And so, how then, if we've got this big, I'm thinking of groupthink and thinking cultural bigness of people, how do Ptolemy's concepts stay with us in this modern astrology piece? If it's, there are hordes of people who say this is not right, where do we see the groupings of people saying, nope, I still think that's applicable? Because obviously we still use it.
Yeah, well, what happened is from the 17th through the 19th century, astrology survived through primarily popular almanacs, which were like things you can look up in order to see the different seasonal, periods and different predictions for like growing crops and agriculture and things like that. And there were some very basic astrological predictions in those almanacs. And occasionally there were little pockets of astrologers who would like reprint Lilly's text, Christian Astrology, or sometimes would write their own text, which was like an imitation or where they were building on some of the astrology they inherited from William Lilly. Eventually, what happens in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, so let's say around the year 1900 or 1901, is that astrology starts to be revived as a result of the Theosophical Society and the growing interest in occult and sort of like metaphysical subjects that was surrounding the burgeoning New Age movement, basically. So around 1900 is the start of what we would call like the New Age movement and interest in alternative spiritualities and things like that. And astrology was one of the things that was grouped in that category that sort of got revived in interest at that time.
Hmm. And it's interesting because at that time I'm thinking about the stories, just moving that forward several years of names like Aleister Crowley,
Mhm.
who are even bringing this more and more to light, and that was never necessarily his intention, but astrology is again hitting that mainstream again and it's coming out a little sideways. They didn't love what he was practicing, but we did have our name out there.
Sure. Yeah, there was a number of early astrologers, like in the early 1900s, that got into astrology again, and they tried to get a hold of some of the older texts, like William Lilly's texts that were written in English, and read them. And there was one astrologer that was really influential named Alan Leo, and he was a theosophist. And so he believed in things like karma and reincarnation. And he got really into astrology, especially natal astrology. But he found the subject really hard to learn when he first tried to learn it. So one of his goals in life was to simplify astrology and to make it more easy to learn, basically, but also he
Mhm.
wanted to push the interpretation more towards character analysis because he felt like his motto was character is destiny. And so he started changing
Mm.
astrology so it wasn't as much focused on like concrete prediction of external events, but instead it was more focused on analyzing a person's character based on their birth chart. So this was the start of the movement towards a more psychological astrology. And around the time you see the birth of depth psychology through the works of people like Freud and eventually Carl Jung.
Yeah.
And astrology starts trending in a more psychological direction. At the same time, there had been new planets discovered, such as Uranus in the late 18th century and Neptune in the 19th century, I believe. And astrologers started, after a few decades, integrating those planets into the system and starting to study them and understand what their significations were and what they meant in astrology. And in some instances, astrologers started integrating them and changing things like the rulership scheme in order to include them by first assigning Uranus to Aquarius and then later Neptune to Pisces.
So, with these discoveries, though, of the planets throughout our history, I think it speaks to our advancement, right? And our expansion, even mentally, to be able to consider something outside of where we were. And we see things like this even as we consider in astrology the lunar cycle, where I start in that new moon phase and I've got to outgrow by the time I get to the end to become something that I haven't been before. So astrology follows the astrological cycles that we even have.
Yeah,
Seems.
and also just like events and developments in history happening in the world in general as well. Like, for example, Uranus being discovered around the time of the American Revolution and the French Revolution also. And those two revolutions being very much symbolic of some of the themes that we even still today associate with Uranus, which is a very like revolutionary planet and can be somewhat destabilizing and can indicate sudden upsets or overthrowing the old order and things like that.
Mhm.
So we have sometimes examples of that when new planets or new celestial bodies are discovered, that there's something that happens in the world at that time that represents symbolically what that new planet means.
Absolutely. So it would be interesting to think about, this idea of as above, so below. That vibration hits here, and so it trickles down to us. Would we have described the would we have had and would we have described the revolution the same way had we not discovered Uranus? Where would we have assigned that maybe made any form of sense at that time? I think that's interesting to think about.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see. So I know we're at an hour, so I'll try and hurry up the rest of the history of astrology. So we get psychological astrology, character astrology. We get new changes to the system due to new planets being discovered. Eventually, Pluto's discovered in the 1930s. In the 1940s, we see the introduction of sun sign astrology, and astrologers start writing newspaper columns based on your sun sign, which is really something that's easy to calculate because all you need to know is your birthday, and you can calculate what sign of the zodiac the sun is in when you're born. So from the 1940s and 50s, especially forward, sun sign columns become popular in newspapers and magazines, and that continues to help to encourage the revival of astrology in the public consciousness in the 20th century. After being out of the public consciousness for a couple of centuries, it starts becoming popular again. Eventually, in the 1960s, there's a huge wave of new young astrologers that enter into the astrological community and start practicing astrology as a result of the not just the New Age movement, but also the counterculture movement of like the hippies of the 1960s and 70s. And especially around 1968, 1969, there's just like a huge influx of younger people in their 20s and 30s. This is largely like the Pluto and Leo generation, the baby boomers that were coming of age at that time. And astrology was like part of the counterculture and was seen as like an alternative thing that people were exploring in addition to other concepts and other things at that time.
Yeah, and we're buying jewelry and we're wearing stones and it's all kind of coming back out at that time, getting back to the natural science or the natural practice of it, certainly on the table.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so they were the ones that completed the shift of astrology and its integration with depth psychology, especially astrologers such
Mm,
as Liz Green, who took the works of Carl Jung and continued to combine them with astrology so that astrology was seen as a tool for psychological analysis. And the astrological birth chart was primarily interpreted and looked at within a psychological context rather than through a strict, like predictive or deterministic, mechanistic sort of model.
mhm, mhm.
So that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, 1980s, and that pretty much brings us up to the present time where, as we mentioned earlier, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a revival of interest of going back to look at older texts in astrology, and some astrologers started to realize that astrology, as it was practiced in the 20th century, was much different than how astrology used to be 3 or 4 or 5 centuries ago. So
Sure.
some astrologers started translating texts so that we could recover some of the ancient traditions and combine them with the modern traditions. There was also a movement of some astrologers to go back into academia and get their academic degrees so they could interface with and make astrology more reputable in an academic context. And lots of different movements like that. There was also a revival of interest in Indian astrology in the West in the 1990s, and many Western astrologers got interested in studying astrology from India because that tradition was much more continuous over the past 2,000
Yeah.
years. and wasn't broken like it was in the West from the 17th through the 19th century. So that kind of brings us to where we are today, where eventually the internet in the 1990s was the last major change where there was an explosion of astrology, and suddenly computerized reports where you could calculate your birth chart through a program or through a computer was a huge shift over the past few decades. And that made it much easier to do astrology. And that's just increased over the past few decades, first with astro.com and other websites where you can calculate a chart for free online. And now more recently through different apps on your phone where you can calculate your sun, moon, and rising. And in the past 5 or 10 years, it's shifted where people don't just know their sun sign, but they also know their sun, moon, and rising. So there's another influx of young people into astrology, and there's also a spike in the public consciousness and familiarity with astrology that's happening over the past 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. And so do you think, as you think back throughout the history, that it is just always the people that bring the spike, or do you think that happens as above, so below?
Yeah, I mean, I think the astrology will reflect that and tell you different times when astrology becomes more popular. But yeah, it's something that changes in the public consciousness at different points based on different social and philosophical and religious or scientific reasons, just based on things that are currents in different generations. And there's some generations that don't really catch that bug, and there's others where certain generations just get really into astrology, and those are the ones that help to repopularize it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for coming and giving us a breakdown on if somebody wants to take this further and they want to get deeper into the historical study, where would you point them? What are your resources?
Sure. So my favorite book on the history of astrology, and it's actually my favorite astrology book ever, is titled A History of Horoscopic Astrology by James Holden. And that's my favorite book on the history of astrology. I'd recommend it to everybody. He gives you a whole 4,000-year history of astrology, but he primarily focuses on the individual astrologers throughout the course of the history to tell you who the most important astrologers were and to tell the history of astrology through their lives and through their works. So that book, there's also a book, 2-volume set by Nicholas Campion, titled A History of Western Astrology, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And that's a more detailed and thorough treatment that goes into a lot more about the history and philosophy and different components surrounding the conceptualization of astrology in different periods than Holden does. But they work very well together as 2 books, or 3 books, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And you wrote a book.
I did. I wrote a book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune in 2017. It took me 10 years basically to write it, but it's basically an overview of that original tradition of horoscopic astrology that started in the 1st century BCE and the first basically like 1,000 years of the practice of that type of Western astrology that uses the fourfold system of planets, signs, houses, and aspects. So I basically traced that system back as far as I could go, and then I showed how it developed and who the most important ancient astrologers were, like Claudius Ptolemy. And I try to introduce astrologers to techniques that were lost until recently, such as the concept of sect, which is the difference between day and night charts, the concept of whole sign houses, which was only recovered over the past 20 or 30 years, and also finally the concept of Time Lord techniques, which are very important but somewhat exotic timing techniques that were used in ancient astrology to determine when the potential of certain planets would be activated in a person's life and would manifest the promise that was indicated in the birth chart. And so I spend 2 chapters talking about those timing techniques as well. So that's my main focus, is that tradition of astrology.
Absolutely. Well, but it's beautiful because if you are listening to this portion of the courses and you're thinking, I want to know a little bit more, now you've got a resource or 4 at this particular point that we can link in the description box down below, and you can go check those out. And Chris is a great resource just in general. So we'll make sure that you have his connection information in the description box down below as well. Chris, thank you so much for coming to break down and talk about the astrology of what we're preparing to launch into so we can understand where we're coming from, which will maybe help shape for whomever's listening where we're going to go next as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, good luck. I'm really excited to see your entire series. And I think this is a great benefit that you're doing for the astrological community. So I'm pretty inspired what you're doing here. And I'd like to have you on at some point on my podcast to talk about some of your work on the astrology podcast at some point here before too long.
Yeah, absolutely will. I am willing, and I just appreciate your support, and appreciate you participating as well. This is a really cool, big thing. So it's neat to see people rallying together and other astrologers just saying yes. And I think that seems very historic to me, where as a people, as astrologers, at some point we were what we had, you know? So it feels very, very neat to see us kind of rallying around this particular topic.
Yeah, astrologers are always usually the forerunners in using new technologies and utilizing new technologies to advance the practice of astrology and to promote it. And I think this is another great example of astrologers sort of trailblazing in terms of you launching a Kickstarter and you being one of the earliest people, earliest astrologers in the past decade to successfully fund a Kickstarter in order to teach a series of free online astrology classes to people from around the world. That's a really unique thing that, this is the first time in history anything like that is possible. So it's really cool to see that and to witness it in live full-time action here and also to be a part of it. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We'll make it into your next book. We'll carry the history forward yet.
Right, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, you guys, we're going to wrap up today's lesson. All the information will be in the description box down below. We will continue on our series by moving now into the astronomy, where we will have both Naomi Bennett and Gemini Brett coming to get us back to the sky and actually talk to us about what we're looking at before we bring it down to the 2D paper versions that we'll be looking at as we continue on. So thank you very, very much, everyone, and we will see you in the next lesson.